The $30 million F-16 had been dead on the tarmac for 6 hours when the old man in coveralls wandered into the restricted area. Tech Sergeant Williams laughed at his ancient tools and told him to get lost. But when the old man fixed the fighter jet in 20 minutes using techniques that no manual contained, Williams learned he had just insulted the legendary engineer who designed the F-16's engine systems. From which city around the world are you watching today? If this story moves you, please subscribe to Rising Life Stories to help us share more stories of hidden heroes. But the old man in coveralls wasn't just any engineer. He was Frank Morrison, the brilliant mind behind the F-16's revolutionary engine design and the most classified propulsion systems in Air Force history. At 72, Frank had officially retired 15 years ago, but he still carried the handmade precision tools that had helped him solve problems that stumped entire engineering teams. What Tech Sergeant Williams didn't know was that Frank had designed every component he was struggling with, had personally tested the systems that were now failing, and possessed institutional knowledge that existed nowhere in any technical manual. The ancient tools Williams had mocked were prototypes that Frank had crafted specifically for diagnostics that modern equipment couldn't perform. The restricted area that Frank had wandered into was actually his old testing ground, and the F-16 that had stumped the base's best technicians for 6 hours was about to be fixed by the man who had brought it to life in the first place. Williams was about to learn that some knowledge can't be taught in training manuals, and that disrespecting a legend comes with consequences that end careers. The $30 million F-16 had been dead on the tarmac for 6 hours when the old man in coveralls wandered into the restricted area. Tech Sergeant Williams laughed at his ancient tools and told him to get lost. But when the old man fixed the fighter jet in 20 minutes using techniques that no manual contained, Williams learned he had just insulted the legendary engineer who designed the F-16's engine systems. From which city around the world are you watching today? If this story moves you, please subscribe to Rising Life Stories to help us share more stories of hidden heroes. But the old man in coveralls wasn't just any engineer. He was Frank Morrison, the brilliant mind behind the F-16's revolutionary engine design and the most classified propulsion systems in Air Force history. At 72, Frank had officially retired 15 years ago, but he still carried the handmade precision tools that had helped him solve problems that stumped entire engineering teams. What Tech Sergeant Williams didn't know was that Frank had designed every component he was struggling with, had personally tested the systems that were now failing, and possessed institutional knowledge that existed nowhere in any technical manual. The ancient tools Williams had mocked were prototypes that Frank had crafted specifically for diagnostics that modern equipment couldn't perform. The restricted area that Frank had wandered into was actually his old testing ground, and the F-16 that had stumped the base's best technicians for 6 hours was about to be fixed by the man who had brought it to life in the first place. Williams was about to learn that some knowledge can't be taught in training manuals, and that disrespecting a legend comes with consequences that end careers. But Frank Morrison was far from a casual observer. He was the principal design engineer who had developed the F-16's engine management systems in the 1970s, the man who had personally overseen the integration of advanced propulsion technologies that made the Fighting Falcon one of the most successful fighter aircraft in aviation history. Frank's retirement from General Dynamics 15 years earlier had been ceremonial rather than complete. He continued to consult on the most complex technical problems that arose with F-16 systems, though his involvement was typically limited to reviewing diagnostic data and providing recommendations through official channels. Today, however, Frank was at Edwards Air Force Base for personal reasons. His grandson, Lieutenant Tommy Morrison, was scheduled to participate in the afternoon training mission, and Frank had driven out from his home in Lancaster to watch the exercise. But as he approached the flight line, he could see that something was wrong with one of the aircraft. Frank Morrison studied the disabled F-16 from a distance, his experienced eyes automatically assessing the situation. The aircraft's position on the tarmac, the arrangement of maintenance equipment around it, and the body language of the technicians all told him that this was a serious malfunction rather than routine maintenance. As he moved closer to get a better view, Frank's decades of experience with F-16 systems allowed him to make preliminary observations that would have taken the maintenance crew hours to discover through formal diagnostic procedures. The slight discoloration around certain engine access panels, the positioning of test equipment, and the frustrated expressions of the technicians all provided clues about the nature of the problem. "Hey!" Tech Sergeant Williams called out sharply as he noticed Frank approaching the aircraft. "This is a restricted area. Civilian personnel are not authorized beyond the red line." Frank paused and looked down at the painted line on the tarmac that marked the boundary of the maintenance area. In his years of working at Edwards, he had crossed that line thousands of times, but always with proper authorization and escort. Today, he had no official reason to be there beyond curiosity and concern for the mission his grandson was supposed to fly. "Sorry about that," Frank said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I was just wondering if you folks were having some trouble with your bird there." Williams looked at Frank with the kind of irritation that comes from being interrupted during a stressful situation by someone who clearly didn't understand the seriousness of the circumstances. "Sir, this is a military aircraft experiencing technical difficulties. Unless you're a certified technician with proper clearance, I need you to move back to the visitor area immediately." Frank glanced at his old leather tool bag and then back at the F-16. Every instinct developed through 40 years of aircraft engineering told him that he could probably diagnose the problem in minutes and potentially fix it before the scheduled mission time. But he also understood military protocol and the chain of command that governed operations on Air Force bases. "Understood, Sergeant. I used to work on these aircraft back in the day. If you think an extra pair of eyes might help..." Williams's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching amusement. "Sir, with all due respect, these are highly advanced fighter aircraft with computerized systems that require years of specialized training to understand. This isn't the kind of problem that gets solved by someone with basic mechanical experience." The condescension in Williams's voice was unmistakable, and it caught the attention of other members of the maintenance crew who were beginning to gather around the conversation. Frank represented everything that frustrated young technicians about older workers: the assumption that experience from decades past was relevant to modern technology. "I appreciate that, Sergeant," Frank replied calmly. "These newer systems are certainly more complex than what I used to work with." Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached the group, having overheard Williams's interaction with the civilian. "Sergeant Williams, what's the situation here?" "Ma'am, this gentleman was asking about our aircraft malfunction. I've explained that this is a restricted area and that civilian personnel can't be involved in military maintenance operations." Rodriguez studied Frank with the kind of professional assessment that experienced NCOs use to evaluate potential problems before they became actual problems. She saw an older man in work clothes who appeared to have some kind of technical background, but who had wandered into an area where he didn't belong during a critical maintenance situation. "Sir," Rodriguez said, "I'm going to have to ask you to return to the visitor area. We're dealing with a time-critical situation here, and we can't have unauthorized personnel in the maintenance zone." Frank nodded, understanding the position that the Air Force personnel were in. "Of course, Master Sergeant, I'll get out of your way." But as Frank began to walk away, he paused and looked back at the F-16. "Sergeant Williams, can I ask what kind of symptoms you're seeing?" "Just out of curiosity." Williams glanced at Rodriguez, who shrugged, apparently seeing no harm in discussing general symptoms with someone who was clearly interested in aircraft technology. "Intermittent power failures," Williams said. "Engine parameters look normal, but we can't maintain stable power output for more than a few minutes." Frank's expression changed subtly as he processed this information. His 40 years of experience with F-16 propulsion systems immediately suggested several possible causes, most of which wouldn't show up in standard diagnostic procedures. "Interesting," Frank said. "That sounds like it could be a thermal expansion issue in the engine management system. Have you checked the calibration drift on the primary fuel control sensors?" Williams stared at Frank with growing suspicion. The terminology the old man was using was far more sophisticated than what would be expected from someone with basic mechanical experience. "Sir," Williams said, his tone now carrying a harder edge, I don't know where you picked up that technical language, but fuel control sensor calibration is not something that civilian mechanics understand. These are military systems with classified specifications. Frank realized that his attempt to be helpful was being interpreted as presumptuous interference from someone who didn't understand his own limitations. The irony was profound. The systems that Williams was struggling to diagnose were systems that Frank had personally designed and tested. "You're absolutely right, Sergeant," Frank said. "I should leave this to the professionals." As Frank turned to leave the maintenance area, Tech Sergeant Williams felt the need to make his point more emphatically. The stress of the 6-hour delay, the pressure from his superiors, and the frustration of dealing with an unsolvable problem had combined to make Williams more aggressive than the situation warranted. "Hold on a second," Williams called out, loud enough for the entire maintenance crew to hear. "I want to see what kind of tools someone like you thinks are appropriate for working on a $30 million fighter aircraft." Frank stopped and turned back, understanding that Williams was setting up some kind of public demonstration of his supposed inadequacy. The other technicians had stopped their work to watch the confrontation, sensing that their sergeant was about to make an example of the presumptuous civilian. "Sergeant Williams," Master Sergeant Rodriguez said with a warning tone, "that's probably not necessary." "No, ma'am, I think it is necessary," Williams replied. "We've got people wandering onto our flight line thinking they can solve problems that our trained technicians can't handle. I think everyone needs to understand the difference between professional military maintenance and amateur tinkering." Williams walked over to Frank and gestured toward his leather tool bag. "Sir, I'd like you to show everyone what kind of equipment you think is appropriate for diagnosing advanced aircraft systems." Frank hesitated, understanding that Williams was trying to humiliate him in front of the maintenance crew. But the sergeant's challenge was direct enough that refusing to respond would appear cowardly. "These are just basic tools," Frank said, opening his bag to reveal an assortment of precision instruments that appeared to be handmade. "Nothing special." Williams examined the contents of Frank's tool bag with obvious amusement. The instruments were clearly old, many of them appearing to be custom fabricated rather than manufactured. To Williams and his crew, they looked like antiques that belonged in a museum rather than on a modern flight line. "These tools are older than I am," Williams announced to the watching technicians. "Sir, when was the last time you actually worked on an aircraft? The 1980s. The maintenance crew chuckled at Williams's comment, appreciating their sergeant's defense of professional standards against civilian interference. But Frank's response surprised them. "Actually, the last time I worked on an F-16 was about 6 months ago," Frank said quietly. "And these tools were specifically designed for diagnostics that standard equipment can't perform." Williams's amusement turned to outright mockery. "Sir, I don't know what kind of aircraft you think you worked on 6 months ago, but it wasn't an F-16 Fighting Falcon. These aircraft require computer-controlled diagnostic equipment that costs more than most people's houses." Frank looked around at the maintenance crew, understanding that Williams had successfully positioned him as a delusional old man who didn't understand the complexity of modern aircraft systems. The irony was almost overwhelming. He was being lectured about F-16 systems by someone who was using diagnostic procedures that Frank had personally developed. "You're right, Sergeant," Frank said. "I'm sure you folks have everything under control here." But Williams wasn't finished with his demonstration. The opportunity to publicly establish the superiority of professional military training over civilian presumption was too valuable to waste. "Sir, let me explain something about modern aircraft maintenance," Williams announced, loud enough for everyone in the area to hear. "These systems are integrated with computer networks that monitor hundreds of parameters simultaneously. The diagnostic procedures require years of specialized training and security clearances that civilian mechanics don't possess." Frank nodded politely, though every word Williams spoke revealed fundamental misunderstandings about the systems Frank had designed. The diagnostic procedures Williams was describing were based on Frank's original engineering specifications, modified over the years but still fundamentally dependent on principles that Frank had established decades earlier. "I understand that these are complex systems," Frank replied. "Complex doesn't begin to describe it," Williams continued. The engine management system alone contains over 3,000 individual components, each calibrated to tolerances that require precision measurement equipment. The fuel control sensors that you mentioned are part of a closed-loop system that adjusts parameters hundreds of times per second based on input from multiple data sources. Williams was now fully engaged in demonstrating his technical expertise to both Frank and his subordinates. But his detailed explanation was also revealing to Frank exactly which diagnostic procedures had and hadn't been attempted. "We've run comprehensive tests on every component in the fuel delivery system," Williams continued. "Pressure sensors, flow regulators, temperature monitors, contamination detectors, everything checks out within specifications. This isn't the kind of problem that gets solved by poking around with hand tools." Frank's expression remained neutral, but Williams's description of the diagnostic procedures confirmed what Frank had suspected. The maintenance crew was following standard protocols that were adequate for most malfunctions, but this particular problem required an understanding of thermal expansion coefficients in the primary fuel control unit, a design characteristic that existed in Frank's original engineering notes but had never been included in field maintenance manuals. "Well," Frank said, "I'm sure you'll figure it out eventually." Williams smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully put a presumptuous civilian in his place. "Sir, I appreciate your interest, but this is a job for trained professionals. Maybe you should head back to the visitor area and let us get back to work." Frank nodded and began walking away from the disabled F-16, leaving Williams and his crew to continue their systematic troubleshooting procedures. But as he reached the edge of the maintenance area, Frank paused and looked back at the aircraft one more time. 20 minutes. That's how long it would take him to fix the problem using tools he had designed specifically for this type of malfunction. But Williams had made it clear that Frank's help was neither wanted nor welcome. Frank Morrison had walked halfway back to the visitor parking area when his conscience finally overrode his wounded pride. His grandson Tommy was depending on this aircraft for a training mission that could affect his career progression, and Frank knew he had the knowledge to solve a problem that might otherwise ground the F-16 for days. He turned around and walked back toward the maintenance area, this time approaching Master Sergeant Rodriguez directly rather than dealing with Williams. "Master Sergeant," Frank said, "I know your sergeant made it clear that my help isn't wanted, but I think I know what's wrong with your aircraft." Rodriguez looked at Frank with the kind of weary patience that came from dealing with well-meaning civilians who didn't understand military protocol. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but we have to follow proper procedures for aircraft maintenance." "I understand that completely," Frank replied. "But what if I told you that I helped design the engine management system that's giving you trouble?" Rodriguez's expression shifted from polite dismissal to skeptical interest. "Sir, are you telling me you're some kind of aerospace engineer?" "Frank Morrison," Frank said, extending his hand. "I was the principal design engineer for the F-16's propulsion systems at General Dynamics from 1974 to 2008. Rodriguez studied Frank's face, trying to reconcile his modest appearance with the claim he had just made. "Mr. Morrison, if that's true, why didn't you identify yourself earlier?" "Because your sergeant made it clear that civilian input wasn't welcome. But this problem is going to require knowledge that isn't in your maintenance manuals." Before Rodriguez could respond, Frank was already walking back toward the disabled F-16, his leather tool bag swinging at his side. Williams saw him approaching and moved to intercept him. "Sir, I thought I made it clear that you need to stay out of the maintenance area." "Sergeant Williams," Frank said calmly, "your fuel control sensor is experiencing thermal drift caused by a design characteristic that was never documented in field maintenance procedures. It's going to require a manual calibration using analog measurement tools." Williams stared at Frank as if he had started speaking in a foreign language. "Sir, there's no such thing as thermal drift in modern fuel control sensors. These are digital systems with automatic calibration protocols." Frank opened his tool bag and withdrew a precision measuring device that looked nothing like the computer-controlled diagnostic equipment that Williams was accustomed to using. "The automatic calibration protocols don't account for thermal expansion in the primary control unit housing. It's a design flaw that I've been meaning to fix for 30 years. Without waiting for permission, Frank approached the F-16's engine access panel and began connecting his handmade diagnostic equipment to test points that Williams hadn't even known existed. Within minutes, Frank's analog instruments were displaying readings that confirmed his diagnosis of the thermal drift problem. "There's your problem," Frank announced, pointing to a gauge that showed measurements well outside normal parameters. "The fuel control sensor has drifted 0.3 degrees out of calibration due to thermal expansion. Your digital diagnostic equipment can't detect the problem because it's measuring the sensor's output rather than its physical position." Williams watched in stunned silence as Frank made a series of minute adjustments to the fuel control unit using tools that appeared to be designed specifically for this type of calibration. 20 minutes later, Frank stepped back from the aircraft and nodded toward the cockpit. "Try it now." Master Sergeant Rodriguez climbed into the F-16's cockpit and initiated the engine startup sequence. The fighter's engine spooled up smoothly and maintained stable power output for 15 minutes without any sign of the intermittent failures that had plagued it all morning. The maintenance crew stood in shocked silence as they realized that the confused old man had just solved a problem that had stumped their entire team for 6 hours. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the stunned silence that had settled over the maintenance area. A convoy of staff cars was speeding across the tarmac toward the F-16, led by a vehicle bearing the flags that indicated the presence of the base commander. Colonel Patricia Hayes emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by several senior officers who had been monitoring the mission delay from the base operations center. The sight of the F-16's engine running smoothly suggested that the maintenance problem had been resolved, but Hayes needed confirmation before authorizing the training mission to proceed. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Hayes called out, "what's the status of the aircraft?" "Ma'am, the malfunction has been corrected. The aircraft is ready for mission operations." Hayes looked around the maintenance area, noting the expensive diagnostic equipment that was still connected to the F-16 systems. "Outstanding work, Sergeant. How did your team identify the problem?" Rodriguez glanced at Frank, who was quietly packing his tools back into his leather bag. "Ma'am, the problem was diagnosed and corrected by Mr. Frank Morrison. He's the original design engineer for the F-16's propulsion systems." Colonel Hayes stared at Frank with growing recognition. Frank Morrison? The Frank Morrison from General Dynamics? Frank looked up from his tool bag with the modest expression of someone who had never been comfortable with public recognition. "Yes, ma'am, though I've been retired for 15 years. "Mr. Morrison," Hayes said, extending her hand, "it's an honor to meet you. Your work on the F-16 program revolutionized fighter aircraft design." Tech Sergeant Williams stood frozen as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The confused old man he had publicly mocked was actually one of the most important aerospace engineers in Air Force history. "Sergeant Williams," Colonel Hayes said, "I assume you've been working closely with Mr. Morrison to resolve this malfunction." Williams opened his mouth to respond, but found himself unable to form words. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward to fill the awkward silence. "Ma'am, Mr. Morrison diagnosed and corrected the problem independently using his own diagnostic equipment. The malfunction was caused by a thermal drift issue that isn't covered in standard maintenance procedures." Hayes turned back to Frank with obvious respect. "Mr. Morrison, the Air Force owes you a debt of gratitude. This training mission is critical to our pilot certification program." Frank waved dismissively. "No debt necessary, Colonel. I just wanted to make sure my grandson's mission could proceed on schedule." "Your grandson?" "Lieutenant Tommy Morrison. He's scheduled to fly this aircraft this afternoon." Colonel Hayes smiled as she realized the personal motivation behind Frank's intervention. "Well, thanks to you, Lieutenant Morrison will have a fully operational F-16 for his training mission." As the command convoy prepared to depart, Hayes pulled Tech Sergeant Williams aside for a private conversation that would determine the future of his career. The public humiliation of a legendary engineer was not something that would be overlooked or forgotten. Frank Morrison walked back toward the visitor parking area, his mission accomplished and his grandson's training flight secured. Behind him, The F-16 Fighting Falcon sat ready for action, its engine running smoothly thanks to knowledge that existed nowhere in any manual. Knowledge that lived only in the mind of the man who had created it. 3 hours later, Lieutenant Tommy Morrison successfully completed his training mission in the F-16 that his grandfather had fixed. The aircraft performed flawlessly, its engine operating within perfect parameters thanks to the calibration adjustments that Frank had made with his handmade tools. Tech Sergeant Williams was reassigned to a desk job pending a full review of his conduct. His public disrespect of a civilian contractor, especially one with Frank Morrison's reputation and contributions, was considered a serious breach of military professionalism that required formal disciplinary action. Frank Morrison returned to his quiet retirement, but word of his intervention at Edwards Air Force Base spread throughout the aerospace community. General Dynamics offered him a consulting contract to help identify and resolve similar thermal drift issues in F-16s worldwide. At Rising Life Stories, we believe that true expertise often comes disguised in humble packages. Frank Morrison's worn coveralls and handmade tools concealed knowledge that no amount of modern technology could replace, and his story reminds us that wisdom earned through decades of experience deserves respect, regardless of how it's packaged. Where are you watching from today? If this story of quiet brilliance and ultimate vindication inspired you, please subscribe and share. Because there are legends walking among us whose contributions to our world are immeasurable, even when they're invisible.